In this chapter, we're going to look at one version of the King's Indian, perhaps the more pure version of the King's Indian. I mean, well, it is very simple to describe Black's plan. You play for f5, and well, you create counterplay against the White King hiding on g1. Ideally, you try to give mate. This is the essence of what Black is trying to do. And for White, well, it's pretty simple. Try not to be mated. Try to break through on the queen side first. At least this is the very pure form. Obviously, there is a bunch of details, and well, it's way too much to try and explain them in the introduction. But in the sort of essence, it is as fascinating as it gets. I mean, sometimes you will see chess game being, you know, very nuanced with positional details, and that's also very interesting. But this is really a battle, or I would say a race. It's like who gets there first. White is trying to break through massively on the queen side, and Black is just gonna have a race against the king on g1. And there is so many great encounters with exactly these things happening in the history of chess. I mean, well, Kasparov, Fischer, Carlsen, you can name a lot of players who has done it excellently. And well, I mean, these are too few. There is many more before them who showed them the way, actually. From Black, it is pretty simple. If White forces him to it, he has to just counter-attack with everything he has. If you look at it from the White perspective, well, White can choose to, well, either go all in and sort of enter this scenario happily I described, or White can try to be quite sophisticated. And that has become more popular. For instance, I mean, I think among others, Kramnik had this idea of, well, we put the king on g1, but then we go rook e1 and bishop f1, and we try to keep things more under control. We make sure that, well, Black cannot just go full attack on the king's side. Actually, Kramnik did it so efficiently that he more or less got Kasparov to give up playing the King's Indian with Black. I mean, Kasparov said something along the lines that, yeah, it's not like the King's Indian is bad, but having to defend my knight off and the King's Indian is too much, and he basically switched to the Grünfeld, which he was very efficient with. But Grünfeld is less committal than sort of these things. We have seen a renaissance of Black playing King's Indians in correspondence chess, and it's still quite a viable opening. But, well, it's too difficult to contain all the plans into in this sort of short introduction. I mainly want to sort of pass on an emotion that this is, well, it's one of the treasures of chess, that this is this, well, Madel-Plater structure, it's called at times. And it leads to some of the most fascinating games of chess. So I hope you will join me on this journey. I really look forward to talking about it. Here we see that White has taken on f5 and Black took back with the g-pawn. In general, I mean, well, it goes against what we would call healthy positional principles for White, at least on the sort of superficial level, right? I mean, Black has just been granted this huge center, and White has given up his control of the center. I mean, one of the huge pluses for White in the King's Indian is that he has this broad center, but here he gives it away for free. However, things are kind of deceptive. White more or less has two possible plans here. He can play for the move f4, which basically makes these pawns passive. At least that's the hope, that, well, White will play f4. Quite typically, Black then would play the move e4, and then he loses a lot of, I would say, dynamics in his position. The position becomes very blocked, and then it becomes a matter of who can maneuver the best. And well, sometimes we will see a white knight jumping to the d3 square, maybe a bishop will go to the c3 square, and suddenly we will see a very positive white flow of pieces. And while, well, I argued that White has given up some of his space advantage, but we will actually see that the White position is much more free-flowing than Black still. So this center can end up quite badly should White play the move f4. Actually, after f4, you will very often see Black not playing the move e4, but rather take on f4. And while taking on f4 obviously leaves you with this ugly pawn, well, then we'll get control of the e5 square for one of our pieces and actually have quite some activity like that. So it's a position where, you will say the sort of free flow of your pieces could matter more than sort of static understanding of weaknesses. A player that also made a huge impression on me some point in the youth here, seeing some Petrosyan game, was White just playing the move f3. So not fully committing to f4, but just making sure that Black cannot easily play the move e4. It's double-edged. Quite often you will see Black play the move e4 anyway as a gambit, and when White takes it, you're going to play the move f4, and you will again have access to the e5 square. But of course, when Petrosyan was doing it, he would carefully make sure that this sacrifice was not really working. And here, again, well, imagine try to have let's say, a knight on c3, a bishop on d3. There is control of the e4 square, not by occupying it with a pawn or a piece, but by actually controlling it. And then you can carefully, perhaps, prepare g4, really undermining the white structure, so the black structure, or just, developing freely. Bishop can go to d2 or e3, rook to e1, and so on and so forth. So both f3 and f4 makes it quite interesting for White here, I would say. To look at it from the black side, well, first of all, I really want to celebrate that I've gotten this powerful full center. And we will see examples where also, well, the g-file can become quite useful. Sure, our king gonna stand on g8 eventually, but we will happily hide it in the corner like this. And I mean, if all things being equal, this is a pretty nice structure for Black. It's something White does when the conditions are quite right for him. And I've mentioned that, let's say, when we play e4, or even if we take on f4, we will get access to the e5 square. Our bishop will be active in this diagonal. So there is quite some potential here. So it's a very interesting that White can take on f5. It feels to me very counterintuitive. But we have seen it in the previous chapter, and we will also see it here, that it's a completely acceptable and valid strategy, but you cannot say it's preferable for one side or the other. It really depends on the specifics, which, makes it more interesting, obviously. We start out with a very interesting chapter. If you look at the black position, you would argue that he has the pieces in a very typical King's Indian fashion. The knight is on e7 and the knight is on h5, and he's ready to play the move f5 next. It generally is how Black is supposed to play in the classical King's Indian. White, however, you could argue, hasn't he placed the pieces a bit awkwardly? The knight on e2 and the bishop on c2. Well, in the normal King's Indian, the knight is on f3 and the bishop on e2 instead. But this is very, very deceptive and important to understand that, on the contrary, White has specifically put his pieces on these squares to sort of make this black setup very inefficient in a way. So it's really upside down. In the normal situation with the knight on f3 and the bishop on e2, Black would use this setup. But in this position, it's much less efficient. To give an idea of how inefficient the setup actually is, in this position, the computer says White can play the move f4. At first sight, to me, it looks, okay, this is as positionally wrong as it gets. But after e4, knight takes f4. Black faces a dilemma. You could take on f4. You could argue, well, don't I have this beautiful bishop in this diagonal? And that is true. But that's also all there is positive to say for Black. White is just going to develop with queen d2 next. And, if you start, let's say, doing something like h6, queen d2, g5, I mean, sure, you will have some control of the dark square, but there is a huge weakness on the f5 square as well. This is just a very difficult situation for Black. So in this position, the computer says, well, shouldn't we play knight f6? We're going to play knight d7 to e5 and take control of this square. But the computer said, yeah, that's a decent plan. But after h3, knight d7, bishop e3, knight e5, queen to e2, modern engines just says White has a considerable advantage here. And I can sort of grasp it because, well, it is a beautiful knight, and this is a good bishop as well. But that's also all there is to the black position. There's very little you can do next. White is going to put probably a rook on d1, for instance, which means that playing for c6 is difficult. Playing for f5, well, that will always leave quite a weakness on the e6 square, and also playing for f5. well, white is very well set up to counter it. So this is actually just a passive and very unpleasant situation for black. So quite shockingly, there is the move f4 in this position, but it's taking a bit sort of us away from our actual topic. But I thought I would just flick it in because, well, for me it's always very interesting when modern engines suggest something that, well, at the time of writing of this book, no one would have even dared to think of. Anyway, the game was a4, or the example. Now black plays the move f5. Well, would he get to play f4? He would probably have a decent King's Indian attack. But white is specifically sort of aimed at taking on f5 in this position, very similar to the previous chapter we saw. Black takes with the g-pawn, and again, we have these debated pawns that in principle looks nice for black, but not sort of that often seems to be the case. The normal move for white here would be f4. The author says it's not that great, but actually the computer says that even this is cool for white. The sort of line goes typically e4, bishop e3, knight f6, threatening to go to g4, so we play the move h3. And now the author says that here you should switch back to our previous structure. You should get in the move c5 to gain some space. It is a reasonable thought because, well, in this position, white is probably threatening to play b4 and c5. But after c5, the author underestimates white's chances. For instance, the computer says taking on c6 is good. It's always scary for me and most likely others to give black this broad center that can advance. But to be honest, even if it advances to d5, white has so good control over the d4 square that it doesn't really matter. It's important for white that he has to move b4 here to sort of try and grab some space. And even, let's say, if black plays a5, b5, c5, closing the structure. The computer says white is just considerably better here. You will play queen to d2, let's say bishop e6 threatens on c4, and we have to make this clumsy move sort of protecting it, but it seems like we will have moves like rook a d1, maybe knight to g3, or perhaps a sort of, you could switch the knight to e3 and the bishop to c3, and it seems white is quite better in this position even here. As well, after c5, another nice move is just to flick in the move a5. Part of it is that, well, later, let's say queen d2, rook b1, we're going to push with b4, and then we have ensured that black cannot sort of seal the queen side with a5. As well, the move a5 has the advantage, let's say bishop to d7. We can start playing moves like bishop a4 to swap off this sort of, in principle, bad bishop of ours. So, actually, well, standard measures also seems to be quite strong in this position. But the move played by sort of white here is even nicer, I would say. It's the move bishop to g5. It's the kind of move that, well, you're not planning to stay on g5 indefinitely. I mean, it's clear that black can kick it with h6. But you would like to provoke a little bit of weakness. You would like to be annoying, I would say. That it's an annoying move for black to deal with. Should he play h6 and weaken his position? But, well, he would like not to. But on the other hand, if he doesn't do it, then he has to tolerate this bishop here. So it's quite a typical move, I would argue. The author is mentioning that after the move f4, well, I think it's bad on positional grounds in general. He says there is this nice move knight to d4, and if you take on d4, h5 is hanging, and we have a threat on h7 next. Oh, that's a bit of a show-off. I would say after f4, just f3, and we are going to enjoy our very nice square on e4. Maybe it's also a typical example of my attitude. I would almost rather be better positionally than to give mate. That's an acceleration, but I think you have understood my preferences by now, right? Anyway, after bishop g5, we played the move h6. The author goes back to h4. I would actually make a case for even going back to d2 is not bad at all. We have provoked the move h6, and I think at times it's a bigger weakness than it seems. I mean, for instance, this knight is very much going to stand on the g6 square, but it's going to be unprotected due to the pawn on h6. Well, maybe I'm almost cheating. I'm just sort of saying what the computer says. But, well, the computer says bishop d2 is reasonable, and I think it's important to understand that after f4, f3, there is no real attack on the king side. It's on the contrary white who gets a knight to e4, and, well, of course it's a somewhat doubled-edged position, but I think pretty favorable for white. But after h6, bishop h4 is also a good move, as mentioned by our author. Well, you keep on being annoying, right, in this way. And, well, you're still insinuating maybe you can play f4 next. But after queen e8, he plays the move f3. And, well, that's also nice. And I think with the pawn on c5, in the previous chapter, I was mentioning that, I mean, while quite typically you will play the move f4 to force the structure, playing f3 is also very possible because, well, this kind of tension that's going to exist now, it can be pretty nice for white. Well, black in principle has this thematic move e4, but let's say here you can take it, and after f4 I guess there is a bunch of options, maybe even sacrificing with e5 for instance, if you really want to open for the bishop. But well, there is this typical sacrifice, but the point is also when it doesn't work, then we get this very sort of favorable mini tension for white, I would say. Black plays knight g6, and white just backs with the bishop to f2. And it becomes very hard for black to do anything. The author says it's the game Sokolov against Stellwagen. And, well, Stellwagen just played queen to e7. And I think, well, we are not used to that black gets, well, black gets a lot, right? He gets these sort of quite nice pawns, also some active knights, and it's supposed to be pleasant for black, but actually here it's quite the contrary, and it's well, it's due to this atypical placement of pieces, and white does it very interestingly. He starts with the move king h1. It is almost starting to insinuate the idea of g4, exactly as I mentioned, because to this knight now being unprotected with the pawn on h7. So having played the move bishop g5 introduces some tactics for white as well. Black goes bishop d7, white goes queen to d2, and after the move king h7, sort of protecting both the h6 pawn and the g6 knight, he just plays the move bishop to e3. Well, you can sort of make an argument for this is a weird roundabout, but as I mentioned, it has provoked some weaknesses, and well, we will see that there is actually a huge threat in this position. Well, white is threatening g4, and there's not so much you can do about it. Well, Stellwagen tried the move rook to g8, but then after g4, he's actually already basically busted. If you go knight f6 now, you can take an f5, knight h4, knight g3, says the author, and white actually just gets to sort of keep this pawn, which basically means black's position is hopeless. So Stellwagen took on g4, takes, and now this nice small combination, bishop g6 here, and then queen c2 check. And basically, well, the king is just stuck on g6. Well, the game was e4, knight takes e4, and then he was so kind to do like this, and we got a sweet mate here. But that's going a little bit far. I think it is a very interesting example the author starts with. Well, the problem is that when I see only the black sort of pieces, I think, yeah, black has done everything the way he should. But it's important we really understand that while this is how we know the classical King's Indian, well, there black is reacting to a very certain white structure, while here, well, we saw these pieces becoming very inefficient. It's true I mentioned that even f4 is possible here, but even without that, just in this structure, there was the more simplistic move f4, which turned out pretty well for white. And there was also this extravagant g5, which I think we saw provoke some weaknesses. So, no, it's, I mean, I think it's an interesting start, and also, well, it's almost like it becomes a very bad advertisement for black in the King's Indian, because, well, if this is not a good position for black, what is? But, well, it's important to understand that these moves are very much designed to counter white's typical way of playing, sort of black's typical way of playing in the King's Indian. And if your opponent plays moves like that, maybe you should aim for c5 or Benoni or whatsoever. But that's a different story. And I think for sort of our perspective, it was a great example showing the strategic vulnerability of the King's Indian, but in a somewhat unusual way. And I think also by now, we are starting to see the huge strategic risk of this sort of pawn structure, right? In this game, sort of the author is showing us how he played an online game in 2009. It almost sounds maybe a little bit unserious, but it's a very good game and it's very instructive. So it's an interesting choice. White has played the so-called Petrosian setup, which is well, you put the pieces like this, and it's quite different in a way. It slows down the black counterplay on the king side to some extent. It was popular quite some years back. I mean, Kramnik was playing it successfully, beating Kasparov, but then at some point it seemed that, well, players found out how to play it with black and it lost some popularity. White has just played the move b3. Well, basically, black was threatening to play a4 himself and sort of ruining the potential of the white pawn structure. So b3 is very normal. One reason that this line is not so popular anymore is this surprising move, knight takes e4. White is going to take back, and black will play the move f5. Now, let's say the knight retreats. We can play g5 like this and f4, and we get the piece back. But, well, the point is that for white, it's not so important necessarily. Well, he would like to keep an extra piece, but that's impossible. But after f3, takes, generally it looks like what I've been telling you, that, well, what matters is white gets the control of the e4 square. But this position is actually quite different. Well, I think I mentioned also earlier that in general getting this e4 square can be awesome for white, but there could be exceptions. And this is one of them, because black has enough firepower to sort of contest the e4 square. So he's just threatening to exchange on e4, and as I said, white goes bishop to d3. He could consider, let's just say, just playing something like this and going knight c5 next. And we are threatening to take on e4, and if you move the bishop back, we will push e4 ourselves, and we have rook f4 tactics attacking in both your bishops in the same way. So, quite surprisingly, but here actually is an exception to sort of the general idea of when white gets the e4 square, he's much better. I just thought it would be interesting to mention that. But after b3, the game went knight to h7. Now white goes rook c1. That is a suboptimal move. The author says correctly white should play rook b1 because he later wants to push b4 eventually. The rook is simply just better placed on b1. And also we will see a rook on c1 is going to be harassed by a bishop on h6. Black plays h5. That's a typical move, but even better now with the sort of pointing in this direction. The game is castling, bishop to e3 check, well, king h1 is a normal move. Kramnik was doing similar at times, but of course this bishop will find a good square on d4. But what the author wants to discuss is this position after, let's say, bishop f2, takes, and now his game goes f5, and we get this sort of pawn structure we want to discuss. I just wanted to flick in that this position is actually just completely fine for black and in a very positional way. The computer says probably you should play the move h4. I remember seeing Dolmatov playing something similar. The idea is just that, well, black actually has a healthy position. Sure, it's a King's Indian, but we have exchanged our, well, potentially both good but often very bad bishop in a way. We're just going to play queen e7 next, and we think we have a pretty solid position. And even, well, I think I recall things like this happening. White wants to play b4, then maybe black will play the move c5, and we will get a structure like this, where this knight will be heading for sort of relevant squares here. It's complicated, but pretty nice for black. And h4 is just a sort of solid, good positional move, grabbing a bit of space on the king's side. But in the game, our sort of author plays the move f5, and we get this structure here. He says that well, this is a pretty good version for black, and there's a lot of truth in that, but it is probably less good than it actually seems. He says that, well, maybe you should do something like rook b1 to push b4, and he's debating a position like this. It's actually a bit shocking for me that, well, I would agree with the author. This is just great for black. The computer says no, white is still better here. The author's argument is something like bishop d3, knight to f6, and he says that, well, next the knight is going to jump like that. But the computer sees through this and plays the move h3. And, well, to me, it looks like a target. But if you play f4, well, we're going to move our king, and then this knight is going to jump to e4 next, most likely. And it's not so simple. If you play the move knight f6, we're going to play f4, and we're going to stop this sort of knight jumping to h5. So I was not able to equalize here. So even in this position, actually, well, it seems quite promising for white when black gets this kind of pawns. Here, I would like to put a huge warning sign, basically a blinking warning sign. Be careful. This structure can be pretty horrible for black. I mean, we see this huge hole in the structure. I mean, imagine a knight, even a bishop standing on this square, and black not being able to get rid of it. Having played the move, let's say, fe4, or even white has taken on f5 and we had to take back with a piece, can lead to this kind of structure, and in general it is very, very strategically dangerous for black. Then we will see some examples where we see how dangerous it actually can be, how helpless or passive the black position can be if there's no counterplay in time. But it's also important to understand that there is scenarios where it actually works pretty well, where black somehow has sufficient pieces. Well, imagine, let's say, a bishop on f5, a knight going to c5, and a knight on f6, sort of fighting for the control of the e4 square. I mean, then the position can be okay for black. This is probably rather the exception than the rule, but there is examples where it works pretty well. And of course, also if white has no knights, and let's imagine only a white squared bishop on e4, maybe we can have a rook on f4 and be doing fine. But in general, this is, we will always say, well, no, sure, white has the e4 square and the King's Indian. White is, of course, slightly better and such. This is way too simplified. But like most structures we are debating in this course are double-edged. They are sort of, in general, balanced. No, this one is in general better, much better for white. And we will see why it's typically that, and we will see the exceptions. And of course, the exceptions are very interesting because this is really a good chance to trap someone who thinks too sort of simplistic and thinks, yeah, this is always better for white. No, it's not always better for white, but in general, it's better for white, and it's all due to this square on e4, especially, well, imagine a white knight on e4 and a black bishop on g7, right? It's more or less as bad as it can be, and this is the nightmare scenario in the King's Indian. There is bad King's Indian, but this is a bad King's Indian that's also passive without counterplay or any kind of hope. So, well, I will sort of end it as I started with, big warning signs, but there is exceptions, and let's delve into the details. The author makes an interesting choice here. He decides to debate what happens when black don't take back on f5 in the previous game, but takes back with the bishop instead. So it's the same game, the internet game we sort of debated, but we are trying to understand what would happen if black takes back with the bishop. The author thinks the white position is pleasant, which maybe it is to some extent, but I've chosen to still look at it from the black perspective, at least sort of in the way we present the game, because the position is quite less bad than we would think, and the computer seems to think black is basically equal here. So white plays the move knight d to e4, and from a structural point of view, it looks awesome, right? This knight is having this beautiful square, and soon the bishop can sort of defend it like this. It's more or less what, well, white kind of dreams of. But there is still some things in black's favor. For instance, there is no weak bishop on g7. I mean, we've seen examples where the bishop on g7 and a bishop on e3. And this makes a major difference, right? Then black has a passive bishop and white an active one, which also controls relevant squares like the c5 square, for instance. So there is positional things in black's favor. As well, there is the potential to challenge this square. We have a bishop, and the knights can both attack the e4 square. So in principle, it could be possible to nullify the white edge there. The author debates several moves. His main move is the move queen e7. He also mentions that maybe, what about playing the move h4, grabbing some space? But there he says it's possible to play an interesting pawn sacrifice. So c5, and after, well, if you take with the pawn, white can take on a6 and then back on c5 with the knight. So the critical move is knight takes c5, and he says takes, bishop c4, threatening this discovered check, and let's say king g7, queen to e1. He thinks that, well, rook e2 is happening next, and there is quite some weak pawns in the black camp. That seems to be correct, and it's actually also the case in this position. Here the computer says even after queen e7, you can play the move c5, because after takes twice, bishop c4, king goes away, rook to e2. It's more or less the same scenario with more than enough compensation for white. So actually in this position, the computer says, well, b6 is a clever move order. Simply, well, getting ready for c5, but also stopping this c5 break for white. And that black has quite a reasonable position. But in the game, white does it in a much more typical way. So the bishop to d3. Black plays knight f6, starting to trade off things on the e4 square. I would say that if black gets to play king g7, then to take on e4, maybe even take twice, and then follow up with knight c5, he's going to have a very sort of decent position. So white has to do something, and well, in the game he plays rook b1, pushing for b4, or not in the game, but in the example. And then, well, what the author analyzes is knight e4, knight takes e4, king to g7. Well, the idea is to, well, in this position, if you take an e4, take back, knight c5. Unfortunately, the pawn on g6 is hanging, right? So we're going king g7 in order to perhaps take on e4 and go knight c5 next, but a very healthy position. Then the author analyzes b4, takes, and he thinks white is better here. He's saying his main move, or actually the only move, is the move g5, but he thinks it's insufficient, and rightly so. But this is sort of playing King's Indian in a desperate way, that you feel you have to do counterplay. Here, actually, black can play it in a very sound positional fashion. The computer just suggests this easy and beautiful move, knight to b8. It opens the A file for some kind of activity, and the knight is going to go to d7, where it both covers the c5 square, but also gets ready for going to f6 to nullify this knight on e4. And actually black has a very decent position here. I'm not saying black is better, but there's nothing wrong with the black position from a strategic point of view. Sure, white has the e4 square, but, well, you can always swap your bishop for the knight there, and we have the A file, and we have a knight sort of rerouting back into sort of a harmonious position. So I don't think black is particularly worse here. So a move like g5, as the author uses as the example, that is way too much. But this position actually I think is quite interesting to just have a look at, because well, this is black playing very healthy chess within the King's Indian. And, well, I think I mentioned Dolmatov in a previous game fragment, and I have seen him do things like this, just actually using the King's Indian to play very sound and positional chess. And, no, it makes it interesting because, well, taking back the bishop on f5, well, it could actually be a very good move, but it has to do, as I said, with having sufficient amount of firepower to attack the e4 square. So, yeah, the e4 square is generally amazing, but there is exceptions, and this is one of them. And again, I think it adds to our arsenal of understanding these somewhat complicated positions. Well, I think a very clever choice by the author to analyze both g takes f5 and bishop takes f5 in the actual same position, because, well, we get to see the completely different directions. But mainly, I'm just impressed that despite this beautiful square on e4, black quite easily managed to neutralize it by very sort of slow and positional means in a methodical way, just undermining the e4 square. Our next game is from the French League in 2011. It's René with the white pieces against a young Anis Giri. It's a brilliant game by Giri. He plays a very atypical way of attacking in this King's Indian position. René now plays the move bishop to d2. This is the so-called Mar del Plata variation, and white has sort of rerouted his knight from e1 to d3 in order to be able to play f3 at some point. But I was sort of brought up with that you should do like René. You shouldn't play f3 immediately, because if you play f3 immediately, black will respond with the move f4. And while normally black would have to play the move knight f6 to create tension towards f4 to force white to play f3, here white has played this f3, f4 inclusion voluntarily. This means that this knight is still on d7, and that makes it more difficult for white to push through c5. And, well, there is beautiful logic in that explanation. The problem is that it's kind of wrong. I think modern experience has shown that, well, white is going to play b4, c5 anyway. And, well, this old-fashioned idea of that b4 was a waste of time turns out to not really be the case. It's a very complicated and very different subject from what we are discussing. But I just thought that, well, it's interesting that these kind of things we really were brought up with in that sort of classical understanding of chess, quite some of them turns out to be wrong. So René plays the move bishop to d2. And now Giri takes on e4. That also looks strategically as wrong as it can be, right? Because now we get this beautiful knight on e4 for free. But already in 2011, the cat was a bit out of the bag. I think it was perhaps Krasenkov who introduced this at some point. And it seems like black just have quite some interesting counterplay. Yeah, this knight is beautiful, but black also has his play with the knight going towards the d4 square. Perhaps white is still better here, and the key would then be to, well, we say overprotect the e4 square. Well, f3 of course protect the knight, but the main point is that after knight f6, it's now possible to, well, reinforce the knight like this. Black do have some activity. Let's say knight to d4, bishop moves away from d3, and black can keep sort of pouring his knight to a beautiful position. But in something like this, probably the knight on e4 is more relevant than these two knights. At least the author thinks so, and the computer also do to a moderate degree. This is a very interesting position. I think the computer wants black just to play a5 and b6 and keeps things rather stable. But white could still be a little bit better here. But René does exactly what, well, I mean, I also recall that one was sort of told that you should do in this position. Well, he plays rook c1. That perhaps doesn't matter so much. It's more that after knight f6, he plays bishop to g5, Giri goes h6, and now he takes and plays the move bishop to g4. Well, the idea is that by putting the bishop here and opposing the counterpart on c8, you're basically saying that, well, you can never really go bishop d4 without allowing this exchange of bishops. And this exchange of bishops is really what we want. What white is dreaming of is isolating sort of the knight against the bishop. And, well, getting rid of a black bishop coming to f5. Well, we saw in the previous example that black really needs this bishop to go to f5 to counter the e4 square, right? It's extremely logical, and I thought it was good, but it turns out not to be so much the case. Well, for instance, I mean, knight d4 would be a horrible move, because now, well, we could even start playing c5 actually, but even if we just played f3 and reinforced the knight on e4, black would have done something quite bad for his position. But Geary just plays the move b6, well, making sure that c5 doesn't happen quite soon. Rook c3, and he just, well, keeps these pieces where they are. And, well, this bishop perhaps looks nice, but it's only have this defensive idea of stopping knight d4. But black doesn't need the knight on d4. He's just trying to play quite sound positional moves. It's true that, well, you can argue this bishop is bad and this knight is good, but the rest of the white position doesn't really coordinate with this narrative, and as we will see, it's extremely hard for white to do anything. For a start, white tries to reroute his knight. Geary goes back like this, and now he plays h5, bishop to h3, and this nice move, bishop to h6. Still, black is suffering from this issue, that, well, he can't move the knight without the bishops being exchanged. But he's capable of improving his position while keeping them like this. But, I mean, you can argue these two black pieces are somewhat stuck. But I would say the same for the knight and even, well, this knight on e4, or on the knight on c2 as well. There's very little you can do with them. So while black has two passive pieces like this, white is actually spending a bunch of energy keeping them passive. So the math doesn't work out fully for white. It's not like white is necessarily better, but this idea of how he has put white in a sort of black in a positional bind with this knight being sort of locked to this square. Well, you can argue that it sounds right in words, but in actual sort of practical terms, it seems wrong. The game continued, rook to e1. Geary put his king there. I think even here, I mean, the computer says white is generally equal if he plays very well. And he should start by playing the move knight to a3, maybe going to b5 later. And, well, from b5, he probably protects the d4 square. But it's sort of, well, technically speaking, the position is equal. But we're talking about equal if white plays very well. And, well, it's just a much more practical position for black. He plays knight to g3. Black puts the queen out, rook f3, bishop f7. And now we can see that while it's not like these pieces has become very active, but black is managing at least to get them slightly out of the way so he can start improving the rest of his position. I mean, now, well, black has a very beautifully coordinated army, and at some point, well, he will be able to move the knight and release this tension, but he's keeping it for a very long while. White also starts moving around, and Geary tries this interesting move, bishop to f4. I think he's probably trying to provoke g3, and then he wants to go back. But actually, well, the computer is so tired of having this bishop here that he wants to put it back on g2. But that's a slightly different story from our narrative. So there is a repetition of moves like this, and now, well, Geary goes queen to e8, and, well, this has a plan. White doesn't spot the plan. White goes a4 and hopes for, well, it's an ugly move, but he hopes for, well, that nothing will happen on the king side, and then it's going to basically be a positional draw. But Geary pushes with the move g5, and there is the threat of g4, right, winning a piece. So white has to take like this, and we have this scenario again where, well, there is a beautiful knight on e4, but with a bishop being capable of taking it at some point, well, it's an awkward tension for white, and this position is just much better for black. So game was knight g3, bishop goes back to g6, exchange on f7 with a threat of mate on sort of f2, or, well, mate, but the pawn hanging. He goes f3, which is a mistake, but the position was bad anyway. g4 happens, which basically undermines things. You can't take on g4 because, well, then you give a check and c2 will be hanging next. René tried rook f1. Geary just moved his king to h8. There's a cute little tactic here that if you take here, you can take on c2. And if you take back, it's a very trivial check and mate like this. So the game was queen e2, queen h7, threatening on here, right? So knight e1, h4, knight h1, and now the move g3. And, well, yeah, you can make a fortress on the king side like this, but while you are solid, you have a knight that's more or less, not more or less, it's completely dead forever. And in this position, well, black will just open with e4 and win easily. So René took, Geary took back, threatening mate on h2 after, let's say, a check and then a checkmate. So he has to take like this, but after bishop f4, there's just no reasonable way of defending. Let's say if you go, yeah, you could go king f2. Perhaps there is at least this hope that if you go rook h, well, we can say queen h1, yeah, then you could actually almost win like this. But in this position, there is just rook g8, and if rook h1, we can take on g3 with check, right? And the king h1, bishop h4, and we're just winning. So, well, René played the knight here, check, e4, and basically it's completely collapsed. I think, well, let's just see the last couple of moves to honor Geary's game. Yeah, black just, well, white resigned in this position. I think the latter part has very little relevance, but I thought it's a very powerful example that, I mean, well, for a start, well, taking on e4 in this position is extraordinary. Yeah, it was just considered lack of positional understanding when I started sort of studying chess, but nowadays less so. I understand that in general this e4 square is nice, but we're starting to see very interesting exceptions, and we notice that the exceptions becomes quite stronger when black has this structure, right? So when you play like this, apparently it's more important to have a solid base with the pawn on d6 than to have more space with the pawn on c5, right? Well, then I thought that this kind of overprotection stuff of the e4 square was quite interesting, with these knights perhaps looking beautiful but not being overly effective. I mentioned also that, again, this idea of bishop to g4, of opposing the sort of, well, this bishop on c8 is supposed to be a very important piece for black in the King's Indian. But, well, it kept being important. It just stood there for a while and even went to d7. And black just managed to beautifully coordinate, despite always having to keep the knight on f5 and the bishop in this diagonal, right? We saw how Geary managed to expand his position and even bring the rook over. So, yeah, I thought a very beautiful game, and from here Geary trashed through, but that doesn't really matter. Here somehow the strategical battle is quite decided. So I hope, well, the last one, and especially this one, has given a very interesting perspective on this kind of structures. Again, don't start believing it's so rosy for black as these games are, but that it's not as hopeless as we saw perhaps in previous examples, especially with the pawn being on c5, I think is an interesting feature. And we're also starting to get this idea of the King's Indian as a somewhat positional opening, where black can actually play in a very strategic fashion instead of just having to give mate, right? So I thought, yeah, a very beautiful game by Geary here. The author looks at this very theoretical position. He's using a game fragment from the very famous candidates tournament in 1953, played in Zurich between Taimanov and Naidov. But he also starts debating several alternatives for white. It's a position very close to my heart, and it brings up great memories, because when I was still a teenager, I remember sitting in my sort of parents' living room and looking through informants, seeing these new developments in this line. And I recall being very fascinated. Korchnoi played the move knight to b5. It looks weird. Can you really start attacking with a piece like this? But after a6, he did this amazing jump to a7. The idea is that despite having used quite some time, if you get to play knight takes c8, it's a huge achievement, because it's going to be very difficult for black to break through with g4 without having this bishop on c8. So the first game saw rook a7, bishop takes a7, b6. It threatens to trap the bishop with bishop b7 followed by knight c8, right? But Korchnoi had realized that you could just play b4, bishop b7, rook to c1, and after knight c8, we are crashing through with c5. And, well, white is just better here. Simply amazing. Well, I think the point is, if like this, you are threatening c6, right? And if you do like that, well, you will sacrifice the exchange, and this bishop survives back to c5 with a huge advantage. So knight b5, an amazing move. Well, black came up with, you should just play the move b6. And you're gonna play a6 next. And Korchnoi's point that he's provoked some weaknesses, it's true, he has. But white has also used some time going back and forth with the knight. So that direct knight b5 was not as efficient as Korchnoi hoped. My love was the move a4. It threatens to do sort of the Korchnoi plan. So if h5, I would play knight b6, b6 and be ready with the move a5. The point is that if a6, I can take here, and you can't take on b5 because of the rook hanging, right? So a4 was doing very well for quite a while, and I won some nice games. But then Kasparov, for instance, started playing the move a5, and I recall losing to Kostronias in a pretty horrible fashion with the white pieces here. And, well, after knight d3, b6, b4, you do get some open files, but black is pretty solid on the queen side and can get some attack on the king side. So a4 was also not that ideal. The move g4 always pops up. It's sort of white switches from direct attacking chess on the queen side to taking prophylactic measures on the king side. And that is quite reasonable. But what became popular in the next phase was this interesting move rook to c1. The idea is after knight g6, white goes c5 without any kind of other preparation. And the point was knight c5, b4. You can't really go to d7 anymore because then knight b5 is strong, attacking the sort of c point without any kind of defense. So black has to go to a6. And then after knight b5, there is quite reasonable positional compensation here for the sacrifice pawn. So this is sort of the modern development. But Taimanov just played the move knight to d3. He wants to push through c5. And, well, with black no longer being able to sort of control that, Naidov just moved his knight to f6. Then c5 happens, knight to g6, rook c1. And, well, Naidov now plays the move rook to f7, and it's very praised by our author. It's a typical maneuver. You want to go bishop to f8, sort of both defending in this diagonal, but also getting the g7 square for the rook. So the game was rook to c2. And now bishop f8 is very logical. But again, turning on the computer somehow shows flaw in the way sort of I was grown up understanding chess. The computer is very insistent you should play the move h5. Generally, we have been told that it's better to do it like this and sometimes try to play rook g7 and g4 without having to play the move h5. And this is also what we will see happens in the game, and Kasparov will do it later. But weirdly enough, in this position, well, the computer says that if you go g4 immediately, black has very decent play like this. So the computer suggests, believe it or not, the move c6. Generally, well, sure, you can try and open files on the king side like this, but after the move b6, you just managed to close it. But then it wants to play g4 with white. And the whole point is that, let's say after h5, h3, rook h7 again, there is a major difference in that this bishop now is dead. Because, well, you see this pawn chain, make sure there is no square for it in this diagonal. And the problem is not so much that this bishop is dead, but when this bishop is dead, so is the rook on a8. And this is a very sophisticated plan where, well, the computer thinks white is quite better here, simply because you cannot bring this rook to the action in any kind of reasonable way. The only way you can do it is to sacrifice the bishop on g4, and it's not atypical in the King's Indian, but if white take cautions, probably he's better here. It's very weird and advanced, but this actually seems to be the modern computer evaluation. So in this position, well, I'm sorry, but you probably have to play the move h5 nowadays. And this really goes against the narrative, well, I was brought up with, and also is sort of the theme in this book. So, well, what they want us to sort of understand is bishop f8, cd6, cd6. The game goes queen d2, g4, rook f2, c1. And now black plays this very typical pawn sacrifice g3. And, well, the idea is after it takes, you play the move knight to h5. That would not really be possible if you had a pawn there. If you had a pawn on h5, you could play h4 followed by the knight to h5. So it is also typical, even if you have played the move h5. But here after bishop h2, you play bishop e7. The bishop is going to come to g5, and there is a bunch of activity with the pieces, and black is already better here. Yeah, a little bit sorry for the confusion, but for a start, I really wanted to sort of talk about the evolution of white plans in this position, because it was a topic that really interested me when I was younger. I mean, well, later I started playing more solid lines. I think it was Larsen who said that, well, if you play like this against the King's Indian, if you're not afraid of getting mated. And when I was young, I was not afraid, but I got mated sometimes, so I got a bit scared and changed my preferences. But a lot of interesting things here, especially this beautiful Korchnoi idea of putting the knight on a7 deserves a mention again. But, well, also, I mean, I always find it interesting when this kind of childhood knowledge, and it's not even childhood knowledge, it's also a later Kasparov game, that we were told to do things in a certain way, but the computer seems to quite disagree. And this idea that you can play c6, and that while you have completely blocked the queen side where you're supposed to play, that can be overruled by a piece being permanently out of play. And here, well, when the bishop on c8 is out of play, so is the rook. This is a very advanced and interesting concept. But of course, well, this g3 pawn sacrifice also is a relevant thing, and it's, well, white is an extra pawn, but black has a very fluent play on the king's side, and is already quite better. So I hope really an interesting example here, despite that all the conclusions are more or less up in the air. Our next game is Mads Andersen against Christian Szabo from 2013. And I feel somewhat personally responsible for the way Mads Andersen goes down in flames, because, well, at that point we were living in the same city in Denmark, and I was sort of helping him a bit, giving him some chess advice. And I'm pretty sure I said that, well, you know, this classical King's Indian with knight e1, it can be quite interesting for white. But I'm afraid I didn't do that good of a job. Anyway, we can see that black has just played the move knight to e8 here. In the previous game, the knight jumped to d7, controlling the c5 square and somehow, well, making sure white could not push c5 immediately. The nice thing about having the knight on e8 is that it connects better defensively with the d6 and c7 square. So there is pros and cons. Mads immediately tries to exploit it. He pushes for c5. Black, well, cannot do much about that, so he plays like this. And now the move h5. Well, this is supposed to be a slight finesse. The point is that if black plays g5, white could consider the move g4. I don't think that's a particularly big deal, but yeah, I thought it's relevant to explain why do they do h5 first here. So c5, g5, and Mads plays the quite logical move rook to c1. But we can see he doesn't fare too well, and nowadays the more popular move is the move a4. It's also the computer's preference. If black continues in the same way with, let's say, knight g6, a5, rook f7, as we will see in the game, quite interestingly, the computers nowadays wants to move c6. It generally looks very weird. Why would black try to close down things? But the point is, you can't really go b6 probably, because now, well, we can take, and you cannot take back the da pawn because of the tension in the a file, right? So that's sort of the basic idea. It's also that, well, let's say you take on c6, we're gonna take back. Now there is the threat of bishop f7, exploiting this sort of pin here, winning an exchange. And if bishop e6, white can sort of punt for bishop a6, g4, bishop to b7. Now he's gonna win an exchange, because if you go rook b8, we can even take on a7 and go a6 next. And, well, it's extremely messy, but if white sort of doesn't get mated quickly, he really crashes through on the queen side. So this is a quite interesting concept. Mas chose to play rook c1. Black went knight to g6, and well, white opened the c file and played the move knight to b5. The idea is that you're threatening to take on a7 in this position. Sometimes black just ignores it, but here probably that is too much. The author mentions that, let's say rook f7, we have knight, well, we take bishop d7, and now after, let's say, a4, bishop h6, his line is bishop to b5. White wants to exchange these bishops, and this is pretty important, but well, to understand why, we have to fast forward a couple of moves. So let's say rook g7 takes, knight b5, g4. In general, well, this looks like a pretty sort of dangerous attack, but white can just defend with king h1 now, and after g3, bishop to b6, because there is no dark squared bishop sort of being able to sacrifice itself on h3, it means that after h4, white can play the move h3. And if you can safeguard your king side like this, well, then there is a huge chance that you will actually manage to invade on the queen side. And the computer says white is much better here. Well, black do have some counterplay like this, but it seems like he will not be in time if white plays his counterplay well. So this is kind of the reason that after knight b5, Chapo thought it was necessary to play this more defensive-minded move. Mas went to a3. Well, the idea is knight c4, trying to exploit the b6 weakness. And that threat is kind of for real. So black went b5, and now Mas went knight to c2. Well, there's nothing stopping this maneuver now. You can't play, let's say, a5, because, well, then you can just take the pawn on b5, right? So in this position, we get a very, very typical King's Indian scenario. Basically, both players are winning. That, of course, cannot literally be true, but white is winning on the queen side, meaning his plan is unstoppable. White is just going to crash through. So black's only chance is to win quicker on the king side. He has to give mate before he sort of is completely busted on the queen side. And we get this kind of very interesting race situation. Because of that, black tries to speed up his attack. He's playing the knight to f6 and going for g4. I mean, on e8, this knight was indeed covering some relevant squares, but now things intensify, and, well, it has to help with the attack. Mas thus executes his plan, g4, knight c6, queen to e8. The author says that now we have really reached sort of an early peak where the game really intensifies. And he thinks Mas slows down too much. There is truth in that. The author says that you should really go a4 now. His point is that, well, if you, let's say, go g3, a very typical King's Indian sacrifice. The idea is that if white takes it, well, then after takes, bishop to h6, or even you could argue a move like h4, sort of followed by knight h5. But probably bishop h6 is the better version in this exact thing here. Then black has very good general compensation. Yes, it's a pure pawn sacrifice, but it's opening relevant lines. Both, let's say, here we can start attacking with a rook, but I would say even more relevantly, it opens for the bishop, and also the knight can go to f4, and sometimes the knight via h5 also to h4, even g3. And this is a lot for a pawn. Of course, you have to dose it correctly and do it at the right time. But in general, when the stakes are so high, getting squares, getting some time could be very much worth it for just a pawn. I mean, here we'll be talking about heavy attacks on both sides. A pawn is actually not that big a sacrifice. But the author wants to actually not take it, but to play bishop to b6 instead. It funnily eyes the d8 square. I mean, maybe even for a knight at some point. What the author thinks is that white is somewhat better here. He wants to, says that you probably, well, a takes b5 seems a threat, and he wants us to take an a4. It's not hopeless, but the computer actually says no. You should play the move knight to h7. It's a little bit slow, but, well, the idea is to get the queen into this direction and basically just give mate like this. And it's not so simple for white to handle. So let's say takes, bishop takes b5, queen to f7. Now, well, black has several plans, as I mentioned this, but also let's say h4 followed by h3. And if after h4 you go h3, well, we can see how it happens in the game. It was like, so not the game, but the analysis. Queen b3. Queen f6, well, it looks crushing, but actually after king h1, queen to h4, this idea of bishop g1 is a clever way to defend. It's actually stops sort of the black attack. It's hard to do anything very quickly now. So in this position, the right idea is to play h4. Probably allowing h3 opening lines is too much. So h3, knight g5, and now, well, we get this typical idea of sacrificing on h3, which is why we really need this bishop. Here it turns out white should go knight to d8, queen f6, and try to block like this. But even a position like here takes queen to f7. Actually, the computer says black is quite better. This is somewhat atypical, I would argue, because don't we have this bishop hemmed in by our own pawns? There is truth in that, but I think it's quite typical for sort of the King's Indian that sometimes in these kind of endings, if you have pawns like this, it means that this king is very much contained, and that, let's say, in an ending also the pawn on g2 could be quite a weakness. So strangely, endings here is not a huge problem for black. You can see that he will have activity with rook f to b8 next, and this bishop can, let's say, go to f6 and d8, and actually he's doing pretty fine, while this king on g1 is going to feel somewhat confined. At least the computer seems to believe that's the case here. Mas chose a very different direction. He went for a typical sort of defensive ploy instead. He played the move king to h1. The idea itself is quite reasonable. After g3, he doesn't want to sort of take on g3 and open the floodgates to his king. Maybe he should have, though, says the author. His point being that takes, h4, bishop to f2, knight to h5, which is a logical move. White now has a nice defensive resource. The move f4, and when takes, then bishop to g4, again sort of trying to achieve this very favorable exchange of bishops. If white gets this position, he's actually achieved quite a lot. But if we back down a couple of moves, in this position, knight h5 was just way too cooperative. It looks nice, and if we can, let's say, jump somewhere here or there next, we're doing fine. But, well, we saw white has this nice resource f4. In this position, black should just play the move bishop to h6 and control more squares, especially the f4 square. And the computer already says that black has a huge attack here. So, Mads Andersen generally had a point. He played the move bishop to g1. The problem is that while this kind of looks safe, it's not that great, actually. You could argue even you should try something like h4 to open with h3. Well, it's a debate if this is possible, but probably knight h7 is strong, but also sometimes you can't just live with him playing h3 because you can take back with the knight there. It's on the edge, but here Szabo played a much better move. He just took on h2. Mas's idea is that he wants to play the move bishop to f2 and somehow keep things closed on the king's side, but it doesn't really work. Black plays the move h4. He's now ready to sort of swing the knight to h5. Mas went knight to d3, but after knight to h5, he faces an unpleasant situation. He doesn't really want to allow knight g3 check next. I mean, let's imagine something like a4, knight to g3 check. Of course, you could have the hope that after something like, let's say this, the white king is absolutely safe on h1. That is true, but also, I mean, we could end up in an ending where the king is just completely stuck on h1 forever. So even here, the computer says white is quite in trouble. But more trivially, you could just take with the f-pawn and you're going to go h3 next, and basically the white's king's position is gonna collapse. So Mas's idea was that he wanted to take back with the king here, and after knight g3 to play the move rook to g1. it also looks pretty solid, right? I mean, how is black gonna crash through next? Even better for white's perspective. After the move rook f7, bishop to b6, bishop f6, he's in time to play the move knight to f2. And I even recall, I don't know if I discussed it with Mass, but at least having these ideas myself, that, well, don't we have everything under control? The h3 square and the g4 square is very much protected by pieces, and the pawn as well. Well, there is truth in that. The problem is dynamics. Yeah, from a passive perspective, black cannot break through. But if he's just willing to sacrifice a little bit, and he has already shown he is by sacrificing with h3, with g3 earlier, right? Then he can break through. And h3 here is extremely powerful. It's just crushing. White takes, and now a nice little intermezzo, just rook b7, forcing this bishop to, well, go away from this defensive diagonal, and then the move rook to h7. Mass reinforces the control of the h3 square, but blacks followed it up with bishop to h4. And the idea is to take on f1 next, and then play bishop to g3, basically anchoring the bishop there, and then perhaps following up with knight h4 next with a huge attack. Mass played the move bishop to g2, and so often in this kind of King's Indian, at least those who ends up with black winning, there is some nice black small tactic. It's the move knight to f5 here. It threatens to jump to e3, and it also threatens to take on f2. So there's no real choice than to accept the piece sacrifice. But then after bishop f2, fg6, queen takes g6, there's no reasonable defense. Black is threatening queen g3 check, followed by bishop takes h3, and it's extremely hard to do something against that. Well, the game was queen f1, bishop, queen g3, king h1, and, well, you can't take on h3 now because of, well, this is legal, as you can't go queen h3 because of the pin. But in this position, Chabo just played the move king f8, and now, well, there's nothing you can do. Mass tried knight takes e5, but even here you just ignore it. Bishop h3 check. Sorry, bishop takes h3, knight g6 check, king e8, and it's going to be made in the h file next. So Mads Andersen resigned here. Yeah, I'm sorry if this became very messy, but we are talking one of the most hardcore lines in the King's Indian. It is just messy by default. And, well, we got this idea of attacks clashing against each other. And here it's obvious that black was first, right? Yeah, there is many things, I think, to sort of remember. I think this pawn sacrifice with g3, it's a very, very classical one in the King's Indian, that we sort of, well, if you play the King's Indian with either side, you need to understand that this is a typical dynamic that black will sacrifice like this. I also think that, for instance, well, a move like knight to h7 here, with the idea of the queen crawling in that direction, or the knight sort of helping to sacrifice itself on h3 is quite useful. If we look at it from white's perspective, for instance, maybe this king h1 move with the idea the bishop coming back and actually here being quite good is a relevant theme to remember. So is, I would say, this theme of, well, here the bishop getting to g4, but of course, well, it wasn't really forced, and I think there was also once earlier we saw, for instance, a position like this, that with no white squares bishops on the board, it is much more realistic to defend like this because there's nothing to sacrifice there. But yeah, a very, very complicated game, and I start recalling why I stopped playing this line of the King's Indian with white. I think it was Bent Larsen who said that, yeah, in this position, knight e1 is the move you play if you're not afraid of getting mated. But, well, sometimes you do, and I think when you get burned by getting mated, you start playing some of the more solid moves. So that's my conclusion, at least to my personal story here. Just before you sort of turn away, I mean, this is still the King's Indian chapter. Yes, it's a Berlin position, but we will get there eventually, so please hang in there. It started as a Berlin, and white played the move d3, but it's quite telling that white is willing to sacrifice a whole tempo just to get this King's Indian structure, but with a small but very, very important detail, which we'll get to. So bishop g7, d5, knight e7. And here we see that white gets to exchange the white square's bishops. We have talked about that before, but here it comes in a very pure form. That, well, without these bishops, it makes a major, major difference. Yes, the structure is generally exactly the same, but because of the lack of bishops, there is a huge turn in evaluation. Black is hoping that he has perhaps more time here and that this doesn't matter so much, but it really is, well, it's a major concession, as we'll see. So white go the move bishop to e3. Black castles and then c4. Now already we see a slight problem from black's perspective. You can't really go f5 because then there is knight g5 threatening to jump to e6. So in this position black plays h6 and white does knight fd2, f5, f3. It looks very much straightforward King's Indian. If anything, it looks like black is quicker on the king side than usually and that white is less well developed to sort of get the attack going on the queen side. But all this doesn't matter because, well, we will see that simply the lack of this bishop, I cannot stress it much, makes such a huge difference. Black keeps having this sort of optimistic mood. So he goes f4, bishop f2, g5, and, well, gets ready to set up his attack there. Now Azarov does knight c3, a very logical and good move. The author makes a point that, well, if b4, then black has the idea of a5, which basically breaks white's beautiful structure. This is true. I mean, the point is if you go a3, you can take, and you cannot take back because there's going to be a rook hanging on a1. The problem is that in this position, the computer says structure doesn't matter so much, or structure matters, but only how the end result will be. And after, let's say, rook a5, a4, b6, knight b3, rook a8, knight to c3, it's true that right now black has a beautiful pawn structure, while sort of the black structure looks more ugly in a way. Well, it's a weak pawn on a4 in a theoretical sense, but reality is that soon we will break through with a5 and then we will basically rid ourselves of this ugly structure. So it only looks bad for a moment, I would say, but there's no particular reason you should play b4 without knight c3. So there's no particular reason either you should allow this extra option for black. But I just wanted to sort of flick in that actually white is still better, even if his pawn structure gets fragmented here. The author mentions that after knight c3, black could go fully passive and try to, let's say, defend like this on the queen side. I mean, you are keeping a solid structure. The problem is it's very short term. White can play knight a4, he's trying to push c5, and while black can make some exchanges and try to hang in there, it's just very, very sad. What Folke does, at least, is typical King's Indian. He tries to counter-attack, which is, well, it's reasonable, it just doesn't work here. b4, knight f6, c5, rook f7. Again, very, very classical. Well, we saw in our previous example that rook c1, while the c file looks nice, it's probably not really where you should put your sort of main attention. Azarov goes knight c4, bishop goes back to f8, and the move a4. We'll see the point of a4 in just a second. In the game, white goes for a plan with c6, but it's important to point out that the timing has to be right. If you play c6 here, black goes b6, and after a4, this very important move a6. Then basically you have created a perfect defensive formation. Let's say white plays a5, then we can go b5. Or if white plays b5, we can go a5, and we keep the queen side closed. White will then have to resort to some kind of piece sacrifice to break through. Maybe that's not impossible, but it's completely unnecessary for white to allow this. So Azarov plays this nice move a4. And after rook g7, now he can break with c6. The point is, after b6, he has to move a5, as we will see in the game. The author mentions that, well, probably you have to take on c6 and live with this. But okay, that was a bit too many arrows, sorrow. But the point is, well, white is threatening to break through on the queen side like this, and when black gets ready for h5, my argument is that sometimes the move knight d5 actually helps defend the g4 square, because it's sort of undermining the knight that's helping on the king side. So this structure is just basically, well, close to winning for white. There's just an automatic attack going on the queen side, and the black counterplay is not really going to get there in time. But to be fair, the same can be said after b6. He played a5. Black chose to, well, keep the queen side protected as much and as long as possible. So AB, knight to b5, queen c8, rook to a7. I guess here, things looks pretty okay for black. At least they look normal King's Indian. Sure, white has good pieces like that, attacking something on the queen side. But the same could be said for the black pieces. They attack something on the king side. So why is this so different? Well, it all comes down to that white can just go king h1 like this. And it's extremely hard for black to do anything reasonable. You really lack this bishop in this diagonal to sort of help creating threats, I would say. Well, if you go take on f3, we can just take back with the queen. And, well, this knight jump here, it doesn't really threaten anything. No, without this white squared bishops, things get very, very difficult. Maybe the best try would be g3. Well, it's not at all impossible to check on g3, but bishop takes b6 more or less wins immediately. The idea is that it takes here, maybe we're going to exchange rooks, then we're going to take on d6, and basically these pawns are going to sort of queen, and the knight can even jump to f5, etc., and so on. So that doesn't really work. In the game, well, he tried rook a8 to fight a little bit against the invader on a7, but that unfortunately allowed rook c7, and knight takes b6. Now it's threatening the queen and the rook, and after queen b8, just knight takes a8. If you take the knight on a8, we take on c7. We are 2 pawns up and easily winning. I think we can stop the game here. So, well, to sum it up, well, I think the key position is this one. I mean, well, I keep stressing it, but without this sort of white squared bishops, the King's Indian really loses a lot of its appeal. I understand it looks very, very similar, and in some structures, well, one minor detail might not matter, and but here, well, it really does, and we saw that black just gets a very sad situation. So, well, I think it's relevant that the author uses one game just to really hammer in that please pay attention to this bishop. It's such a key piece in the King's Indian. I mean, the King's Indian might be dubious for black, but that you have to live with if you play it. But at least keep your sort of trumps there. I mean, sure, without this bishop and this exchange, the white attack was getting slower, but it meant that our counterplay really lacked venom. So I think that's the main lesson here, I think. This game is Van Velde against Krylov from the Olympiad in 2004. Van Velde is a Dutch player, but Krylov played for the blind team. And he's actually a very strong player. I have this strong recollection from 1991 in Benidorm. It was me and Matthew Sadler. We were sitting next to each other and playing against two blind players. One of them was Krylov, which Sadler played. And he actually managed to completely outplay Sadler and beat him, while I barely managed a draw in my game. So, I mean, there was this sort of generation of blind players who actually were very strong and caused, well, strong grandmasters. Well, we would later become strong grandmasters, me and Sadler, considerable problems. But in this game, Krylov gets into trouble against Van Velde. It's a classical King's Indian again. White has played the bayonet attack with b4, and black replied with knight to h5. Rook e1 is the very popular move. I think it was Ivan Sokolov who introduced it, and Kramnik really popularized it. It's a very basic idea that if knight f4, you want to be able to back with your bishop to f1. And as simple as that, more or less. The problem for black here is that it's not so easy to make a next move. Well, the typical move is f5, and then the theory goes knight to g5, sort of threatening like this, and also eyeing this square on e6. And after knight f6, bishop f3, c6, there is really a bunch of theory here. Going into that is too much for this chapter. But that's how things are normally done. Krylov chose to move king to h8. It's a typical move in the King's Indian. I mean, well, it puts the king in a slightly safer spot, but more sort of relevantly, it even has ideas like knight to g8, sometimes bishop h6 is coming, sometimes f5, and this knight from g8 to f6 reinforcing the attack. So it's a very respectable waiting move. And, well, you can say that it's logical to make a useful move, because also white is sort of, his plan is to respond to knight f4 with bishop f1. But what is he going to do next? Well, Van Wely chooses that the knight goes to d2. It threatens the knight on f4, and after knight f4, bishop f1 happens. Well, now the problem for black is what to do next, and that is not very easily answered. I think, well, whenever I get the chance, I'll also sort of repeat this last idea or concept rather, that, well, a knight on f4 is somewhat dominated by a bishop on f1. It doesn't mean that this knight on f4 is not beautifully placed, but with the bishop on f1 somehow controlling the h3 square, this knight lacks quite some of its power, was his point. Krylov follows up with f5, and yeah, that's logical. But now we see white can play the move g3, and as the knight cannot jump to h3 anymore, it has to jump backwards to h5. A typical idea would be now to take on f5, because, well, you can't take back with the g-pawn, because the knight then would be hanging on h5, right? So, well, that would be interesting, actually. But Van Wely just chooses to go for a spatial edge. So he plays the move c5. And, well, the author says that now black makes a huge strategical mistake. And maybe he was almost like tempted to my last remark, because, well, it feels like e takes f5 is in the air. Well, the way to deal with that, the author says, is to play a move like knight to f6. And while, well, this knight has been on a considerable tour back and forth, it does sort of help undermining the center, and having played the move c5 means the d5 pawn is a little bit weaker. Well, white is still doing perfectly fine, but maybe that was better. He plays the move f4, which is generally very logical, right? I mean, white's idea in the King's Indian is to play on this flank, so black seeks counterplay down the f file. The problem is that while, yes, there is perhaps activity in the f file, it also means that the center stabilizes a lot. And when it turns out that the f file doesn't sort of has realistic attacking possibilities, it leads to a very passive position for black. So f4 is a major mistake here, the author points out, and rightly so. Van Wely develops with knight c4. The knight goes back to g8, a4, knight f6, and a very nice move, rook to a2. Well, it's just, I mean, covering the f2 pawn, making sure that this attack in the f file, not that we are scared of it, but that we really sort of try to preempt any kind of counterplay as quickly as possible. The author also mentions that, well, what black probably was trying to set up was the idea of g5. But after takes, knight b5, there is no reasonable way to defend this pawn on d6, because, well, if you play knight e8, you can't do it because the knight on h5 is hanging, right? So in this position, it becomes pretty sad for Krylov. He chooses to play the move knight to e8. Van Wely goes rook c2, bishop d7. And now another very praisable decision by Van Wely. There is many nice things he could do, but he chooses to play the move g4, closing the king's side. Well, knight has to go back to f6 and then move f3. And, well, I mean, this pawn gains space, and it closes the king's side. You can, of course, argue that it's a weakness, and there for sure exist games where black managed to sacrifice through on g4. But, well, if he doesn't, then things really are in white's favor. And that's very much the case here. The author says that it was really essential now to play the move g5. And then, let's say b5, we go h5, h3, something like this. And, well, black will generate some kind of counterplay on the king side. But he's not very well set up. For instance, this king on h8 is a bit in the way in the h file. And, well, white is just much too soon on the queen side. Probably c6 is a threat here. So I don't think it alters sort of the general assessment that black is in huge trouble anyway. But it's interesting what happens. He plays h5. And white doesn't start defending with h3. If you do it like this, well, then black can play knight h7, and the bishop sort of joins the attack, let's say, to g3, the knight jumps to g5. It's really, really helpful for black that he hasn't played the move g5. Well, you can see in this position, let's say here, well, there is much less, there's no possibility of activating this bishop, right? While in this position, it's completely different. Black's play flows much easier. So after h5, white actually has to go forward and play the move g5. And knight h7, h4. The author doesn't sort of hold back here. He says white is strategically winning. And that is generally true. This formation, while perhaps looking risky in a way, well, it cramps black severely, and there is basically no way as well that black can break through on the king side without sacrificing a piece on g5. But, well, sacrificing on g5, it's not going to be with a tremendous amount of power as well. White will try and sort of annoy him in the meantime. Well, he goes rook f7, a reasonable move. The bishop probably wants to go to f8 defend. Knight a5 happens, attacking the b7 pawn. The bishop goes back to c8. And what happens now is also extremely interesting from a structural point of view. Van Willy chooses to play the move c6. Well, it threatens to take on b7, obviously, and if you take on c6, well, you have just opened the queen side, making things easier for white. So b6 is extremely logical. And after knight c4, black actually gets to play the move a6. I mentioned this formation in an earlier game, and I said against pawns like this, it's extremely flexible, because if white plays b5, black can play a5, and vice versa. Actually, black is now creating a similar barrier to these pawns, that they can only be broken by the sacrifice of a piece. Unfortunately for black, his sacrifice on g5 is much less efficient than the one Van Willy is going to build up on the queen side. Van Willy has all the time in the world. He starts by playing a nice move, rook to h2. It's generally preempting that when a sacrifice is going to happen on the g5 square, and he takes back, the rook is well placed in the defensive function there. So they start maneuvering a bit here. I think we can more or less fast forward over this till this position. Now Van Willy chooses to play the move b5, and a5 happens. Of course, well, if you take like this, it's possible, but the author even points out that, well, white has this funny plan, and the rook is actually trapped here. Because, well, this bishop is trapped, there is no reasonable square in the diagonal, so there's no way to defend this rook. This is actually it's a funny theme, right? But anyway, of course, black will play the move a5, and black is basically claiming, well, I have closed the queen side, this is a positional draw. But it's not. So, Van Willy starts regrouping again. He puts the knight to b3 to be ready to sacrifice. And, well, I think it's noteworthy here. It's not like, you couldn't sacrifice here immediately. Maybe even it's better in the sense of a computer, that it wins a little bit quicker. But he sees no reason not to improve his position first. So the bishop, backs to f1, just that, well, should black start sacrificing here, it's better to have things in ideal fashion. So the bishop is sort of helping to tee up against the g5 pawn. Queen e1, also making sure that, well, should this sacrifice on g5 happens, we have control of the h4 square. As well, I like, of course, that it also points in this direction. So rook a8, rook a3, bishop f8, and now Van Willy says, okay, I have put up a perfect setup, it's time. So he sacrifices on a5. And, well, knight to g7, knight c4. I mean, it's interesting that white only have 2 pawns for a piece, yet his position is basically automatically winning. You're just going to go a5 and b6, and, well, you're going to win something. Well, you will push it to b7, and if they take on b6, well, you will push it to b7 eventually anyway. It's, well, it feels like by our normal standard of a piece being worth 3 pawns, in principle, black is up material. But in a practical sense, well, these 2 pawns is going to win at least a piece, probably more. So it's actually white who is up material in a sort of, in a relevant sense, I would say. Krylov understands it well. He decides that, okay, I cannot just sit and wait, so he sacrifices on b5, g5. Well, the author mentions, let's say, rook b8, well, threatening the b pawn, so we have to defend it. And, well, something like this. And now we're going to go knight to d2 next. We're going to take back on f1 with the queen. And then this pawn is going to walk to a7. And, well, I don't know, touchdown is probably the reasonable expression, right? So Krylov sacrifices on d5, but it's desperate. Well, white has, we can see, white has some relevant immediate threats, while, well, what is black threatening? He wants to have to go g5, g4 to get any kind of counterplay, but he's not going to be close to that. Well, he actually gives it a shot, like this, g5, queen b4, g4, but even here, well, you see, white just interpolates this move, bishop to h4. I mean, it's part of why it was reasonable to put the bishop on f2, so that when these things eventually happens, make sure to have it as a good version as possible. The game was bishop e7, b7, he took the piece, and, well, after this, he chose to resign. So, I think a brilliant game by Van Wely, but also, I mean, we should remember that Krylov, I mean, it is certainly making it much more difficult to play chess when you are blind. So, I mean, he's an amazing player, but this was not one of his better days. In general, well, I think that the modern conclusion is that, well, this is not sort of the right square for the knight, because this bishop on f1 is strong. There's a famous game between Kramnik and Kasparov even. And, well, that f4 is a strategic mistake. Well, we saw it. This counterplay down the f-file seemed to be somewhat imaginary, right? And, well, I also thought that g4 is very nice, and that you can follow it up with g5 even then. And, well, this idea of c6 completely closing down the queen side, and that this position, while these pawns sort of keeps black structurally safe, it's not safe enough. You can just eventually break through with a piece sacrifice, as we saw, and win. And I think just, well, a really textbook example by Van Wely here. We are ending off this chapter to sort of bring some hope to those of you who really wants to play the King's Indian. And, well, who better to bring in for that is Magnus Carlsen. A young Magnus Carlsen. This is from 2010, and the time when Magnus was sort of working together with Kasparov. So he was getting some inspiration, some opening files from Kasparov, and uses them in this blindfold game against Levon Aronian from Monaco. Well, this tournament in Monaco happened for a lot of years, where there was a mixture of rapid and blindfold chess. A very interesting event for spectators, but also for the players. I was allowed to play it once. I was last, but somehow hold up quite decently against, well, the world elite in both rapid and blindfold. And it was a very, very interesting experience. I also played Aronian there, and I remember before one game, in blindfold you had to play on a laptop and make your moves on the screen. And well, I made my move 1d4 and the computer wouldn't allow it, and I kept trying until at some point Aronian told me, well, you're black and I have just played the move 1b3. And, well, we went on for there, and the game was a draw. But, well, anyway, back to chess, back to the King's Indian. Aronian has just played this move bishop to d2. I think I spoke about it in an earlier game, that, well, this is how I was brought up to play. And we saw Anis Giri even taking on e4 in this position. But Carlsen has other ideas. He plays the move knight to f6, the typical King's Indian move. And then after f3, he doesn't go for f4 and this very sort of, well, direct attacking style following up by g5 and h5. No, Carlsen plays the interesting move king to h8, like we saw with Krylov in the previous game, right? It's keeping things flexible, and it's sort of having the king in a somewhat safer area on h8. It's a useful move, and it's hard to do other sort of direct useful moves. So it's basically passing it on to white what to do next. As well, because the king is safer on h8, there's no action in this diagonal. Part of black's idea is to play c6 or c5, not really afraid for, let's say, en passant, and then this diagonal potentially opening up after a white c5. So Aronian chooses to play the move g4. Also very typical of Aronian. Aronian is an incredibly talented player. He never made it to world champion and most likely never will. But he was close to and was sort of seen as, if not the favorite, one of the top outsiders in several candidates tournaments. But, well, that part he didn't manage, but he has produced so many interesting games and ideas. And, well, this is also typical of him. He is, well, it's like he's ready to dance. I mean, Carlsen provokes with a move like king's h8, and Aronian is not going to back down. And it leads to very interesting games, and sometimes you're going to be on the receiving end. Carlsen plays the move c6. I guess in general you would be told that, well, black attacks on the king's side and the king's Indian, and it's white who attacks on the queen's side. But it's not always true. I mean, we've seen, for instance, in the Van Vele game that white played the move g4, and he's actually trying to block the king's side with that. I mean, well, we saw, let's say, something like f4 and h5, then white would happily shut everything down. But, well, the move g4 also weakens this king area a bit. And then a move like c6 comes in handy, sort of trying to some extent undermine the center. I mean, it's a very, very complex pawn structure right now. Everything is threatening to take everything. Or, well, we think it's complicated now, but wait a bit. Aronian does the move king to g2. The computer thinks not a great move. It wants to play the move a4. I think at the time of the game, the understanding was that, well, black is just going to shut down the queen side. Then let's say a4, a5, h4, c5. And that basically black has now created a perfect fortress on the queen side. But probably white is still better here, says the computer, and I kind of agree. Well, even let's say something like the computer wants to move rook f2. Let's say black plays f4, just trying to shut everything down. White is going to put his rook on h2, but a knight will jump to b5, a bishop will go to c3, the king starts going in this direction towards c2. I saw even in this position the top computer line already has the white king on c2. And there will be, I mean, a mixture of not completely shutting down the king's side, combined with, let's say, a knight on b5 can suddenly sacrifice itself on d6, or maybe you can sacrifice on e5. There will be various things black has to deal with, and it's not fully comfortable. I'm not saying that white is winning. I'm saying that black can defend, but it's going to be somewhat unpleasant. And, well, this idea of just allowing to shut down the queen side, I think is quite interesting here. But not something that well, at least I recall from that time, we would think, no, black just plays like this and is completely fine. But it seems perhaps not to be the case. Well, Aronian played the move king g2, and Magnus just responds in a brilliant way, b5. I mean, this is like youthful optimism, right? You play the king's Indian, and you just, I mean, well, here you're attacking his pawn structure like this, and you're doing it like, I mean, from the other side. It's really like, well, you're playing like you are winning, and that this big king's Indian center is just full of weaknesses, right? And here, well, he actually has a reasonable point. It's not easy for white to do anything. I mean, if you take this direction, black is going to recapture here, obviously, and black will just have the center. If you do like this, well, we're going to take here, and again, it's black who gets the best central influence. The author mentions, well, you could go very ambitious and let's say play g5, knight h5, and then take a pawn on b5. But well, something like this, and he says maybe f4 with the knight jumping in this direction is going to be massive compensation. Aronian decides to, well, not be bullied to that extent. He just thinks, okay, let me keep my central structure. And while Carlsen has played amazingly aggressively, he's capable of shifting now. He starts playing positional chess. He plays the move a5. Again, white cannot really exploit sort of, well, if you take on b5, you're going to take on d5, and so on and so forth. But Aronian just backs with knight f2. He's reinforcing his center. But Carlsen chooses to play around it. He plays the move b4 now, and this obviously lessens the tension sort of against the white center, at least seemingly. But he has a very ingenious plan in mind. The knight goes to a4. Again, someone with a less positive mindset and a more solid attitude would now play the move c5. Again, just being very proud of having sealed the queenside in a King's Indian. That would be considered quite some achievement. And even while in the previous example I spoke about white being better, he had a knight going to b5, there was interesting sacrificial possibilities. Here, there's not much of that. Sure, you can play the move a3, but probably black can just reply something like rook b8. I think both players are probably fine here. Carlsen has a much more interesting idea. He plays the move bishop to b7. Generally, well, that is supposed to be a ridiculous square in the King's Indian, right? It's staring into this pawn formation. But, well, with a bit of imagination, well, you will see that, well, we're going to get rid of this formation quite quickly. Aronian plays rook c1, and the author calls it careless. He says he should have played instead the move king to g1, but, well, that would be going back and somehow admitting defeat or something like that. Would still have been by far the best move, but well, maybe that was too difficult to do. So rook c1 he plays, not sort of expecting things to go horribly wrong very, very quickly. But now Carlsen releases the potential of the bishop on b7. He swaps on e4 first and then sacrifices like this. And yeah, it's a piece for 2 pawns, but well, this bishop is pointing massively towards the black king, and also this pawn on g4 is really a nuisance now, because, well, it allows the queen, for instance, to enter the h4 square, and of course, well, as well on g4, it just doesn't provide any kind of cover for the black king. So, well, yeah, the basic idea, of course, is that bishop f3 trying to oppose in the long diagonal just loses instantly to rook takes f3, and if queen takes f3, there is knight f4 check, and we're going to win the queen, right? Just a trivial point. So in this position, there is obviously the threat of some kind of discovered check, so the king has to go to g1. And, well, now Carlsen just plays brilliantly. It's like the game is just one flowing emotion of attack. I mentioned a move like queen h4. That's how sort of a normal player like me would do it. But Carlsen comes with much more power. He plays e4. It threatens e3 winning back the piece, obviously. That can't really be allowed. But it's also very hard to do anything against, except for if you choose to take here. But then, well, you're gaining time, right? You get to play bishop to d4 with check. Sure, you're giving away a pawn, but A, you're open for the bishop, and, well, B, also, you win quite some time. If you go king g2, the author mentions that queen e7 is basically just busting open this potential. The point, again, being that bishop f3, you can just sacrifice like this, and now knight f6 is just going to undermine this knight with an easily winning situation. So Aronian chose to play rook to f2. Carlsen took it. Aronian took back. And now after queen to h4, there's really nothing you can do. I mean, white is just winning trivially. The game was queen e1, rook to f8. And basically we have 3 pieces attacking f2. And there's no way you can defend that. And obviously because of the pin, the king cannot, there's nothing you can do. So the game was something like this. And here Aronian resigned. I think an awesome game to end this chapter, right? I mean, you somehow start to feel that you would like to play the King's Indian yourself. You're going to win games like Carlsen here. But we should perhaps also remind you that, well, it was Petrosyan who said that, well, I'm happy people play the Benoni and the King's Indian. How else should I feed my family, right? So, yes, they're going to be black wins like this, and they're going to be amazing, but White is going to win his bunch as well. And, well, I hope that now you are better equipped for understanding this very fascinating King's Indian structure.